the largest offensive operation undertaken by Russian ground forces since the escalation of hostilities entered failure conditions within the first phase of its execution. Structured around a multi-axial assault on the Pokrovsk operational axis, the grouping involved no fewer than 15 consolidated maneuver elements, drawn from 4 distinct military districts and reinforced with airborne, artillery, and rear echelon units. Total combat personnel deployed to the corridor exceeded 185,000, supported by a tracked armor column numbering over 2,000 units and an aerial support configuration composed of rotary and fixed-wing strike assets. The strategic goal was the seizure of a bridgehead west of Pokrovsk, facilitating encirclement patterns along the Kramatorsk-Slavyansk axis. Within 48 hours, the offensive lost cohesion, contact lines were severed, and core logistical functions entered freefall. The operation, initially declared as a rapid envelopment campaign, transitioned into a static entrapment scenario, with maneuver groups immobilized across exposed flanks, cut off from supply, and subjected to uninterrupted area denial strikes. Geographically, the assault corridor was constructed along 3 primary vectors: north through the Kostiantynivka approach, central through the Marinka-Kurakov line, and south via flanking elements operating from Volnovakha sectors. Terrain intelligence identified the northern corridor as heavily fortified. However, command emphasis remained on rapid mass movement rather than phased breaching. This miscalculation introduced critical vulnerabilities during the first movement cycle. Assault battalions advancing toward Pokrovsk encountered multi-layered area resistance zones preceded with topographical interdiction points, concealed artillery kill zones, and precision-guided anti-armor emplacements. Command nodes positioned within static C2 shelters were targeted during the first wave of Ukrainian counter-battery operations, resulting in total disruption of the assault echelon's vertical command integration within the initial 12 hours. Radio relay towers collapsed across the central corridor, and all primary satellite uplinks from mobile command posts were blacked out by synchronized EW targeting and drone-launched munitions. The result was a decapitated forward grouping with no functional coordination above battalion level. Simultaneously, supply corridors constructed along secondary and tertiary routes entering from the Donetsk and Zaporizhia lines encountered saturation strikes on fuel depots, bridging convoys, and logistics trucks operating under dispersed camouflage protocols. Sustained interdiction neutralized refueling capacity across all assault columns. Mechanized units operating in depth lost the ability to rotate, reverse, or maneuver. Static position clustering began at kilometer 30 of the central axis, where no fuel assets were recoverable. Mobile repair columns were unable to enter the forward zone. Armored elements became stationary targets under wide-area drone reconnaissance and loitering munition saturation. Aviation units tasked with CAS, close air support, were unable to operate beyond the initial flight window due to degraded forward air control and a complete absence of visual deconfliction markers. Multiple aircraft lost flight vectors due to signal failure, with 2 confirmed instances of fratricide attributed to misidentified positions in EW-contested airspace. Rotary wing assets operated below effective ceiling due to layered manpads presence along the Pokrovsk perimeter, resulting in attrition and emergency withdrawals. By operational hour 16, no continuous aerial coverage remained above the lead columns. The ground force was functionally unshielded from elevated strike vectors. The rate of operational disintegration outpaced established contingency thresholds. Units advancing on divergent timelines collided in staging zones without hierarchy, mission clarity, or resupply allocation. Convoys crossed paths without route clearance. Infantry battalions offloaded in incorrect grid zones. Medvac corridors failed to establish. Centralized triage units never deployed forward. Personnel became static within fields and road junctions under permanent surveillance, subjected to precision strike cycles in 5-hour waves. The projected assault radius of 70 kilometers collapsed to a pocketed depth of less than 15, surrounded by active kill zones on all sides. What had been declared as a strategic offensive entered encirclement geometry by the end of the second operational cycle. Ukrainian forces, operating in phased elastic defense, completed partial closure of lateral axes west and north of Pokrovsk, exploiting terrain-funneled choke points and disrupting all viable withdrawal patterns. The Russian grouping, now fractured and unsupplied, was immobilized in exposed terrain under unbroken ISR coverage. Encirclement parameters were not broadcast through official channels. The operation was still presented through state media as an ongoing advance. The Pokrovsk offensive transitioned from structured penetration to uncoordinated survival within the first 72 hours of deployment. The failure to establish logistical permanence across the central and southern corridors initiated an irreversible degradation of combat capacity. Forward fuel distribution points, constructed along secondary rural routes and shielded by mobile cover, were either identified and destroyed during the preliminary hours of engagement or rendered unreachable by disruption of bridging units along the Samara and Vovcha river lines. Armored convoys, initially structured for phased advancement and rotation, became immobile within exposed open areas devoid of tree cover or structural masking. Units clustered around known resupply waypoints, triggering chain detonation scenarios as Ukrainian indirect fire systems conducted saturation strikes with graduated area denial munitions. The pace of degradation outstripped command capacity. At brigade level and above, no stable communication interface remained operational by the second day. Division-level command posts, deployed within hardened bunkers near Donetsk and Kostiantynivka, were subjected to sequential precision missile strikes calibrated for subterranean penetration. At least 4 brigade-level headquarters were confirmed neutralized with total loss of staff personnel and communication equipment. Command hierarchy collapsed horizontally, forcing battalion and company commanders to revert to analog signaling, messenger dispatch, and line-of-sight voice coordination under full exposure. The absence of satellite uplinks, digital frequency bands, and protected radio repeaters reduced strategic command presence to inert observation. Situational awareness degraded to sub-tactical levels. No unit above company strength retained complete operational control. Evacuation chains failed to form. Casualty extraction vehicles were either repurposed for ammunition transport or eliminated during cluster munition strikes on presumed safe zones. Forward field hospitals were never activated due to route denial and airspace interdiction. Wounded personnel remained untreated in field perimeters or within destroyed transport hulls, contributing to rising fatality rates. No rotation system was implemented. Rear echelons collapsed inward, joining forward units without mission assignments, food reserves, or fuel stockpiles. Several identified columns of support personnel were found occupying roadside embankments with no operational orders, no mobility, and no protection. Total loss of command recognition led to spontaneous abandonment of positions and equipment in multiple sectors. The breakdown of route control along the Volnovakha approach permitted Ukrainian assault detachments to conduct lateral interdiction strikes, severing the southern feeder line entirely. Remaining access corridors were funneled into narrow routes under aerial surveillance and continuous drone reconnaissance, making all movement observable and targetable within minutes. No unit operating along these corridors retained uninterrupted maneuver for more than 3 kilometers. Mechanical losses reached critical density. Over 1,000 armored units remained stationary due to fuel depletion, track damage, or tactical abandonment. No salvage operation was authorized or attempted. Psychological collapse accompanied logistical failure. Uncoordinated units, deprived of air cover, resupply, and chain of command, initiated self-directed withdrawal in multiple vectors. These movements led to overlapping fields of fire, friendly fire incidents, and the further disintegration of unit cohesion. Numerous detachments initiated defensive postures without perimeter establishment. Internal reports referenced panic signals, unauthorized transmissions, and mass requests for extraction from non-designated sectors. Command posts receiving these requests were unable to validate coordinates or authorize movement, further deepening the isolation of forward groups. The chain of response collapsed. In several sectors, support units attempted to establish static shelters using unreinforced engineering vehicles, which were eliminated within minutes of deployment. Attempts to reposition aviation assets from rear airbases into forward operating positions failed due to active airfield denial. 3 secondary landing zones in the southern corridor were rendered unusable following saturation rocket artillery strikes. Aerial platforms attempting emergency resupply were intercepted or downed due to contested airspace and the presence of infrared-guided missile units along the Pokrovsk axis. No air bridge could be established. The air corridor was functionally shut. Disinformation cascaded through internal channels. Multiple units received contradictory orders regarding withdrawal, reinforcement, or static hold. Tactical misinformation, whether deliberate or resulting from signal degradation, induced circular maneuvering, route duplication, and force overlap. Fragmented formations, unaware of each other's presence, collided along forested or urban approaches. In at least 2 recorded instances, opposing Russian formations engaged in reciprocal fire after misidentification under electronic jamming conditions. No centralized verification system existed to prevent further repetition. The humanitarian condition of trapped personnel deteriorated rapidly. Ammunition reserves were depleted within the first 72-hour operational window. Water supplies in exposed zones reached emergency levels by day 4. Food stockpiles were exhausted in mechanized elements, with rations redirected toward lighter infantry formations. Internal groupings developed isolation behaviors, with certain units refusing contact with adjacent formations lacking identification signaling. Panic reports, spread via shortwave devices and visual beacons, confirmed the presence of collapsed moral order in certain sectors. Surrender was discussed in isolated incidents but could not be coordinated due to the absence of viable communication with opposing forces and the total breakdown of courier channels. By the end of the 4th operational day, the assault force no longer met the definition of an integrated military formation. It existed as an immobilized, fragmented mass of armored vehicles, cut-off infantry, depleted support crews, and non-responsive command personnel, occupying contested terrain under total surveillance and fire superiority of the defending forces. The offensive no longer functioned as an attempt to seize terrain, it had become an attempt to survive without contact, without mobility, and without command. By the 5th day of the Pokrovsk operation, the remaining Russian offensive grouping was no longer engaged in forward motion, tactical maneuver, or controlled retreat. The entire force, initially exceeding 185,000 personnel and composed of elements from no fewer than 23 consolidated brigades, had transitioned into static, uncoordinated clusters under full-spectrum isolation. Ukrainian operational planning, structured around phased encirclement with overlapping denial arcs, achieved complete containment geometry between Pokrovsk, Seladov, and Vuhledar. All principal ingress and egress vectors, both paved and auxiliary, were either physically severed or classified as zero survivability corridors due to persistent surveillance and instantaneous indirect fire saturation. The central and southern groupings, initially tasked with rapid penetration toward transportation hubs west of Pokrovsk, had become immobile following the loss of forward fuel points, elimination of armored engineering units, and aerial interdiction of mobile bridging equipment. As terrain reconfiguration by Ukrainian forces advanced, each remaining movement channel was narrowed to choke points subject to real-time artillery and drone surveillance. These channels ceased to function as tactical routes and instead became deliberate kill zones. Any convoy exceeding 4 vehicles was subjected to destruction cycles within 3 kilometers of movement. Light infantry attempting to exfiltrate on foot encountered sensor-triggered cluster munitions and anti-personnel submunitions seeded across all known withdrawal paths. Attempts to re-establish contact with rear command were unsuccessful. All long-range communication links remained degraded beyond restoration. Centralized control elements within Rostov and Taganrog reported incomplete data, unreliable positional mapping, and a lack of validated sitrep reports. Airborne relay systems, typically used to restore vertical signal flow under degraded battlefield conditions, were not deployed due to continued airspace denial and EW saturation across the encirclement arc. Communication reverted to short-range encrypted burst transmission, which proved ineffective due to battery depletion, signal compression interference, and the physical fragmentation of units across non-contiguous terrain sectors. As a result, no forward unit retained awareness of flanking positions, route status, or adjacent formation integrity. Efforts to breach the encirclement using reserve armored formations from the eastern corridor failed during initial contact. Two mechanized battalions advancing from Donetsk via the Avdiivka corridor were intercepted at pre-calculated interdiction zones and neutralized within 20 minutes through layered FPV drone waves followed by thermobaric artillery strikes. The use of decoy convoys by Russian forces to divert fire assets proved ineffective, as Ukrainian ISR protocols successfully filtered target masses based on heat signatures, movement pattern analysis, and electromagnetic emissions. The breach attempt not only failed to relieve pressure on encircled units but revealed additional force composition details to Ukrainian targeting platforms, accelerating subsequent strike sequencing on trapped elements. Evacuation protocols collapsed. Airlift was not viable under conditions of contested airspace and continuous manpad saturation. Helicopter extractions were attempted along the southeastern axis during low-light conditions but were aborted after loss of visual control and navigation jamming within the electromagnetic exclusion zone. Fixed-wing aircraft never entered proximity. Civilian-grade vehicles repurposed for evacuation were either abandoned under fire or rerouted back to rear staging zones. No medevac coordination was restored. Personnel wounded in previous contact engagements remained untreated across forest edges, agricultural fields, and urban wreckage zones. Ammunition depletion reached critical threshold across all trapped units. Defensive firing was reduced to single-shot exchanges. In many sectors, Russian personnel ceased returning fire entirely. Small arms magazines were rotated among squads, and crew-served weapons were discarded due to lack of compatible ordnance. Artillery batteries ran dry by day 4. Mortar systems became unusable due to absence of charges. Supply drops, theoretically feasible through unmanned aerial platforms, failed to materialize due to GPS interference, drone interception, and the complete absence of navigational security within the encircled radius. Hunger, dehydration, and sleep deprivation contributed to rapid physiological and cognitive decline among troops. Water purification tablets were exhausted. Field rations had been depleted 2 days prior. Improvised resupply via local requisition proved unworkable in flattened terrain devoid of remaining civilian infrastructure. Internal reports suggested that several command-level officers abandoned forward units using light armored reconnaissance vehicles or unmarked civilian transports during the first wave of disintegration. Remaining junior officers attempted to maintain minimal control using improvised coordination methods, including visual signaling, whistle codes, and fireteam relays, but all such efforts collapsed once visibility fell below operational minimums and positional convergence ceased to be meaningful. Reports of fratricide, accidental discharges, and uncontrolled flight increased. Panic transmission signals, previously rare, became frequent. The encircled grouping no longer functioned as a military instrument. It lacked coordination, supplies, communication, maneuver capability, or coherent objective. It existed as a dispersed, static mass of combatants under uninterrupted drone, missile, and artillery coverage. Ukrainian forces continued precision elimination of fuel nodes, thermal sources, and any visible movement using combined drone-artillery coordination loops. No air cover was provided. No corridors opened. No negotiations initiated. The collapse of operational viability had been completed. The Pokrovsk offensive no longer represented an assault. It represented the geometric conclusion of overextension, miscalculation, and systemic failure. The grouping that had advanced toward Pokrovsk as a coordinated force now remained as a series of heat signatures, scattered across a kill zone with no exit vector, no chain of command, and no further options. By the 6th operational day, the trapped Russian force within the Pokrovsk sector had entered the final stage of uncoordinated disintegration. No semblance of maneuver, defense, or communication hierarchy remained. The encirclement, now completed in all cardinal directions, had hardened into a closed fire control grid maintained by layered reconnaissance, autonomous drone tracking, and pre-programmed artillery coordination. Ukrainian units held full-spectrum dominance over the air, thermal, acoustic, and electromagnetic signatures of the containment zone. Every quadrant within the pocket was mapped, indexed, and segmented for controlled saturation. No gaps existed. No openings emerged. The encircled force became the static object of a calibrated, long-duration elimination procedure. Ukrainian fire systems operated in sequential cycles of suppression, triangulated adjustment, and target refinement. Rotary wing munitions were replaced by quadcopter swarm deployment, enabling persistent ISR coverage without crew exposure. Ground-based fire controllers coordinated FPV drone waves against armored remnants and isolated infantry clusters, with each strike calibrated using real-time telemetry. Long-range artillery batteries rotated ammunition types between thermobaric charges for static clusters and sensor-fused submunitions for armored targets. HIMARS units, operating from outside counter-battery reach, maintained strike rhythm across critical mass concentrations. Airburst fragmentation systems were deployed above tree-line sectors, denying vertical cover to dismounted personnel. Within the encirclement, conditions approached terminal degradation. Fuel reserves were entirely exhausted. Generators ceased operating, removing all artificial heat and communication capability. Electronic devices failed. Battery chains collapsed. Night visibility was reduced to zero. No aerial resupply was attempted. Units reverted to full blackout posture, ceasing all electronic transmission to avoid drone detection. Infrared shielding materials were absent. Heat signatures from bodies and residual vehicle warmth provided sufficient contrast for thermal targeting even under low-temperature masking. Water was no longer available in operational quantities. Snow and rain collection methods were employed, but storage materials were compromised or discarded during earlier movement phases. Personnel consumed contaminated runoff from shell impact craters. Gastrointestinal failure rates spiked. Wounded individuals succumbed without medical intervention. Antibiotics and clotting agents were depleted. Tourniquet applications were improvised with fabric and cord. Amputation procedures were conducted with field knives under unmedicated conditions. Medics abandoned triage due to unsalvageable casualty volumes. Command cohesion did not re-emerge. All long-range communication remained inoperative. Emergency beacon devices lacked satellite link. Attempts to break through by isolated squads were denied by drone loitering munitions. Field movement became synonymous with exposure. Each motion across open terrain triggered cluster engagements. Infantry began to occupy burned-out vehicle hulls and crater complexes for shelter, with no hope of reinforcement. Thermal blankets and insulating gear had been abandoned during earlier withdrawals. Hypothermia set in during night hours, accelerating collapse among immobilized formations. Psychological collapse followed material disintegration. Morale ceased to function as a category. Reports from drone audio intercepts captured unstructured shouting, nonverbal distress, and unauthorized orders for equipment destruction. Firearm discharges without enemy presence were registered in multiple zones. Unit markings were removed. Rank insignia discarded. Surrender was discussed in fragmented units but deemed tactically impossible due to continuous fire loops and lack of safe passage vector. No contact was made with opposing forces. White signal flags were not acknowledged under ongoing saturation. Attempts to reinitiate withdrawal from within the pocket ended in annihilation. Units attempting to concentrate force along the eastern perimeter were destroyed by layered drone, artillery complexes within 40 minutes. No extraction corridor could be opened without dedicated armor support, which no longer existed in functional quantity. Mechanized remnants were burned out or stranded without power cells. The few remaining tanks served as static cover points. Vehicles with intact mobility were trapped behind cratered roads, disabled bridges, and interdicted wood lines. Airfield infrastructure east of Pokrovsk was non-operational due to runway fragmentation and presence of scatter mines. No reinforcements were dispatched. Russian Rear Command did not authorize a new assault vector. Air Command did not commit strike packages. Electronic warfare units failed to re-establish signal shielding. No ceasefire call was transmitted. Internal channels within Russian military networks avoided references to the Pokrovsk group. Official briefings reverted to discussions of positional stabilization along secondary axes. Casualty numbers were not updated. Families received no change in status notifications. No public acknowledgement of containment conditions was issued. By the end of the sixth day, satellite imagery confirmed no further coordinated movement within the pocket. Thermal mapping indicated isolated clusters of body heat without pattern. Most tracked movement was quadrupedal, injured soldiers crawling toward destroyed vehicle hulks or heat-leaking building shells. Infrared dispersal patterns declined. Active weapon signatures ceased. Artillery radar returns dropped to zero. RF scans detected no uplink attempts. Operationally, the pocket ceased to emit data. The trapped grouping passed beyond battlefield activity into mass static occupancy of a saturated kill zone. No force attempted further breach. No internal detachment attempted breakout. The encircled structure had reached full non-functionality. What remained was mass, residual presence, and uncollected fatalities. The Pokrovsk grouping, once declared the spearhead of a strategic breakthrough, had collapsed into a silent field of immobilized remnants, surrounded by unmanned fire vectors, unacknowledged by command, and unrecoverable by doctrine. Following the structural immobilization of the Russian Pokrovsk assault group and the systematic eradication of its maneuver and survival capability, Russian military institutions entered a phase of procedural silence. No communiques were issued from the Joint Staff. No special status reports were transmitted to rear formations. The term Pokrovsk was removed from briefings and map annotations within formal and semi-formal command structures. Digital overlays used by operational coordination centers no longer displayed encirclement markers or personnel concentrations in the sector. The pocket was erased not by withdrawal, but by classification removal. Strategically, the grouping had ceased to exist. This deletion was not accompanied by an accounting of casualties, missing personnel, or equipment losses. No loss report was compiled for internal consumption. Battalion log ceased updates. Names of officers and contracted personnel assigned to the offensive remained unrevised in personnel registries. Rotation schedules continued listing units that had ceased contact 5 to 6 days prior. Compensation systems remained untriggered. Families awaiting reports received no change in unit location, no funeral notification, no confirmation of death in action, and no acknowledgement of unaccounted status. The human structure of the offensive remained suspended in administrative limbo, not confirmed lost, not declared missing, not reassigned. Internally, Russian command architecture did not initiate replacement planning for the collapsed force grouping. No reserve division was tasked with closing the territorial breach created by the failed offensive. Adjacent units received orders to reinforce fixed positions, with no mention of flank recovery or bridgehead restoration. Operational posture across the Donetsk and Zaporizhia theaters reverted to containment doctrine. Signals traffic indicated a full cessation of offensive mobilization west of the Avdiivka-Kostiantynivka axis. Air operations were reallocated to sectors with stabilized contact lines. The Pokrovsk vector ceased to function as a line of effort. What had been declared a strategic push was functionally removed from the theater's operational map. Satellite reconnaissance confirmed no retrieval activity. No engineering formations were dispatched to clear approach routes. No armored corridors were reconstituted. Mobile bridge units remained in rear positions. Fuel columns were reassigned to alternate sectors. Recovery logistics, typically mobilized within 48 hours of engagement freeze, were never activated. UAV overflight logs from Ukrainian ISR confirmed that the encirclement remained static for 4 additional days following final strike saturation, without any incursion or attempted salvage. The decision was structural, not to recover, not to announce, not to reclassify. The operation was not absorbed into the historical record. It was terminated administratively in real time. Within domestic Russian media, the offensive was never officially declared ended. Television and print channels continued to air segments referencing planned tactical realignments along the central line of contact. Public maps omitted Pokrovsk altogether. Military commentators referred to ongoing engagements in neighboring sectors while avoiding the subject corridor entirely. The informational architecture was adjusted in concert, as though the operation had not taken place. Archival footage was removed. Briefing slides deleted. After-action reports were blocked from distribution. Internal military education institutions received no directive to include the operation in training modules. The failed grouping became doctrinally invisible. This procedural silence extended to command culpability. No court-martial was convened. No general officer was dismissed. Field commanders assigned to the Pokrovsk operation remained on active status with no reprimand entered into service files. Personnel records did not flag command failures, evacuation refusal, or loss of unit integrity. Logistic officers overseeing fuel delivery and airfield denial zones remained in assignment. Unit cohesion failure, command desertion, unauthorized withdrawal, and communications breakdowns were not codified. The military system responded to catastrophic loss not with post-mortem review, but with systemic omission. Operational analysts within Allied and neutral observation channels categorized the event not as a battle but as a model failure. The Pokrovsk offensive demonstrated the inability of the Russian armed forces to execute synchronized large-scale maneuver under modern reconnaissance and precision saturation conditions. The degradation was total: no air-ground integration, no protected logistics, no survivable communications, no inter-echelon coordination, no fallback doctrine. The offensive did not collapse under superior resistance, but under exposure to modern combined arms denial architecture. The strategic takeaway was not territorial, it was structural. The failure at Pokrovsk also served as a visible signal to external military planners regarding the threshold of Russian operational capability. The commitment of over 185,000 personnel, across 5 echelons, supported by full-spectrum mechanization and theater-level logistics, was insufficient to breach 70 kilometers of defended terrain. The concentration of armor, artillery, rotary, and fixed-wing support failed to alter the ground equation. Doctrine premised on numerical overmatch and depth shock collapsed under multi-layered countermobility and drone-mediated fire control. The symbolic value of the collapse exceeded the local geography. Pokrovsk became the case study for exhaustion of offensive viability. The silence that followed the collapse was not merely bureaucratic. It was strategic. By refusing to articulate the loss, the command infrastructure preserved the internal fiction of capacity. The military continued to present itself as capable of offense while planning no new movements. Units trained for theoretical thrusts, yet remained in static defense. Announcements referenced rotational deployments, not maneuver. Logistics prepared for consumption, not advance. The structure remained intact. Its function had ceased. Pokrovsk, in military terms, was the firewall. Beyond it, no further offensive model would be attempted without reconstruction of doctrine, tools, and command logic. The grouping did not return. Its name did not remain. The map was intact. The force was gone. Following the silent administrative cancellation of the Pokrovsk offensive, the force structure that had enabled the assault disintegrated across all levels of command, logistics, and doctrine. No attempt was made to reconstruct a comparable grouping. No units were reconstituted under the same designation. The registry of formations deployed in the Pokrovsk corridor remained unreconciled, files left open, internal rosters unclosed, and casualty registers unprocessed. Battalion identifiers ceased receiving updates, and in multiple cases, serial numbers were retired without ceremony. The existence of the grouping became an operational blank space in the wider order of battle. Rear depots that had supplied the offensive effort reported unscheduled shutdowns. Fuel redistribution nodes servicing the Donetsk and Zaporizhia vector were closed or repurposed. Ammunition convoys staged for resupply were redirected to depot hold rather than issued forward. Medical logistics chains suspended outbound movement. Field ration contracts were paused without explanation. Contractor organizations attached to forward support, including pontoon bridging, road engineering, and vehicle recovery teams, received return orders to base without engagement. The entire structure of offensive support entered involuntary stand-down. Without direct acknowledgement, the system recognized that no force remained to sustain. Within remaining maneuver formations stationed in adjacent sectors, morale degradation accelerated. Units rotated out of Pokrovsk-adjacent corridors reported refusal to deploy into similar terrain, citing lack of air cover, fire saturation, and absence of viable logistics under current battlefield conditions. Officer briefings omitted references to encirclement, but personnel understood the operational void. Discipline declined. Internal command reports confirmed reductions in compliance with maneuver orders, increased frequency of unauthorized equipment shutdown, and spontaneous dispersal during rotation cycles. Central Command issued revised morale statements unrelated to actual conditions. Political commissar units resumed cultural training cycles and ideological reinforcement without operational reference to Pokrovsk. The void was maintained. The wider military apparatus responded by shifting strategic emphasis. Offensive rhetoric was reduced in volume. Public references to large-scale maneuver ceased. Planning templates were revised to prioritize localized stabilization, strategic defense in depth, and targeted attrition. The language of expansion was removed. Internal documents emphasized endurance, not breakthrough. Theater-wide force posture shifted into lateral entrenchment. Airspace utilization was reduced to reconnaissance and long-range fires. Battalion-sized probing actions replaced brigade-scale assault design. Operational doctrine transitioned from maneuver-centric models to fixed-arc fire grid maintenance. Simultaneously, Ukrainian forces retained control of all Pokrovsk-linked vectors, converting the former corridor of assault into a calibrated counter-pressure zone. The terrain, saturated with destroyed material, unexploded ordnance, and drone kill signatures, was not cleared for occupation but held under surveillance. Ukrainian fire teams operating forward reconnaissance reported no Russian force regrouping within a 70-kilometer radius. ISR platforms confirmed a permanent withdrawal posture. The zone was reclassified not as contested territory, but as a vacuum, a geographic consequence of operational self-destruction. International observers noted a shift in external perception. The Pokrovsk disaster marked the first operational event in which the Russian offensive concept was seen to fail at scale under conditions of full commitment. Allied intelligence services classified the event as an irreversible fracture in assault credibility. Defense briefings from multiple European and North American entities ceased to model future large-scale Russian breakthroughs west of Donetsk. Military planning structures in bordering states revised force deployment models downward. What had once been considered a potential overreach vector became a dead sector. The psychological footprint of Russian ground power was reduced without counteraction. Strategically, the Pokrovsk operation revealed the final phase of offensive attrition. Force concentration beyond critical mass proved unsustainable under conditions of precision strike, degraded airspace control, and real-time battlefield transparency. The doctrine of weight-based penetration was rendered obsolete. No concealment method, no depth reserve, no fuel scaling could compensate for the multi-layered denial grid applied by the defender. The Russian command did not adapt. It absorbed and then withdrew without substitution. The human cost of the failed operation remained unprocessed. No bodies were recovered. No repatriation occurred. No prisoner lists were exchanged. Ukrainian forces documented presence through visual confirmation, thermal drone footage, and orbital imaging, but did not initiate clearing operations. The terrain remained marked as hazardous and static. Within Russian borders, families received no status change. Veterans groups made no statement. Survivor accounts were not circulated. Commanders involved in pre-operation planning remained in assignment, unmentioned by name. By structural indicators, the Russian military ceased to pursue high-density, deep-field offensive operations after Pokrovsk. Resource allocation shifted to static artillery positions, drone production cycles, and counter-reconnaissance net development. All forward planning documents referencing battalion tactical groups in breakthrough roles were shelved. The strategic engine of large-scale assault was halted not by defeat in combat but by annihilation through denial. Pokrovsk became the case study, the dead zone, and the unmarked grave of offensive doctrine. The system moved on. The map remained. The army stood still. The aftermath of the Pokrovsk encirclement marked a turning point in the structure, perception, and trajectory of Russian ground force projection. No formal doctrine was revised, no senior officials dismissed, and no reform committee activated. Yet across the military-industrial chain, battlefield theater, and geopolitical calculus, the collapse of the Pokrovsk offensive was treated, implicitly and structurally, as the final operational confirmation that the Russian Federation had exhausted its capacity for organized, deep-field maneuver warfare under modern high-intensity conditions. From the perspective of force structure, the consequences were immediate and permanent. Battalion tactical groups, previously considered the core offensive instrument of Russian land doctrine, ceased to be deployed in massed formations. Orders for new assault grouping formation were rescinded. Training centers reoriented towards static positional warfare, drone operations, and rotary fire support integration. Simulated breakthrough scenarios were removed from officer coursework. No new pipeline of combined arms maneuver experimentation was initiated. The military did not attempt to evolve beyond Pokrovsk. It absorbed the outcome by ceasing to replicate the scenario. Material loss assessments, while never officially published, were modeled by independent observers and corroborated by satellite-based battlefield forensics. The destroyed grouping accounted for a substantial portion of Russia's remaining high-readiness armored assets. Over 1,000 armored fighting vehicles were confirmed abandoned or neutralized. Fuel and logistics depots along the forward axis were obliterated and unrecovered. Air defense detachments embedded in the assault columns were lost without replacement. The attempt to construct layered offensive depth across multiple terrain corridors had instead accelerated hardware attrition to rates beyond industrial replacement capacity. The result was a measurable depletion of deployable mass, both in absolute terms and in logistical infrastructure. Command and control capabilities degraded in parallel. Pokrovsk exposed the failure of vertical integration under contested electromagnetic and aerospace conditions. High-capacity C2 nodes were eliminated in sequence without redundancy activation. Tactical decisions devolved to subunit levels, resulting in chaos, fratricide, and fragmentation. Subsequent deployments avoided establishing centralized command footprints within artillery range of the front. Field-grade officers operated under dispersed control, with delayed coordination and non-synchronized timing. The promise of network-centric command was replaced by survivability models. The command apparatus did not recover. It adapted by dispersing, and by lowering expectation of continuity. Strategic communications followed the same arc. In the days after the operation's effective collapse, official channels shifted language from advance and stabilization to repositioning and containment. External engagement by Russian spokespeople omitted references to Pokrovsk altogether. The term was never used in Ministry of Defense briefings following Day 3 of the operation. Public cartography platforms ceased updating positions in the area. Press access was denied. Field correspondents were pulled from forward units. What could not be controlled in result was controlled in narrative by deletion. Ukrainian forces, for their part, did not pursue the encirclement zone as a vector of territorial expansion. Instead, the perimeter of the former kill box was fortified and monitored. The psychological advantage of the terrain, now associated with destruction of numerical superiority, was deemed more valuable than physical occupation. Every mention of Pokrovsk in subsequent Ukrainian communications reinforced the symbolism of invincibility through defense and modern targeting integration. The message was not about victory. It was about the irreversible invalidation of mass assault. Among Russia's allies and neutral observers, the signal was received. Defense procurement patterns in adjacent states shifted. Confidence in Russian battlefield initiative eroded. Technical emulation of Russian doctrine was discontinued in multiple allied militaries. Export clients delayed or cancelled orders for hardware implicated in the Pokrovsk failure. Internally, this translated into a cumulative reputational recession, not catastrophic, but final in its implication. The offensive power of the Russian state, so long presumed to rest on mass, depth, and layered momentum, had failed under exposure to modern surveillance, precision fires, and degraded coordination. Civil-military interface absorbed the consequences silently. Families of the deployed grouping received no status updates. Official channels maintained procedural stasis. Digital footprints of the units involved were erased or archived. Names of formations were retired without ceremony. Memorialization was not permitted. Pokrovsk became a structural ghost, present in absence, referenced only by those who survived peripheral engagements. The system did not commemorate its failure. It neutralized its memory. In the logic of warfighting evolution, Pokrovsk was the final confrontation between the industrial-era model of assault and the distributed, real-time, high-precision model of denial. The outcome was not a battle. It was a demonstration. The Russian military entered with mass and left with silence. The ground was unchanged. The army was gone. From that point forward, Russian operational planning ceased to revolve around penetration and maneuver. The new logic became conservation and delay. Everything beyond Pokrovsk was a fallback, a readjustment, a compression. The map retained its lines. The doctrine did not. Pokrovsk stood as the unspoken line after which nothing advanced. Not because it could not, but because it had already ended.